مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. من جديد يواجه العالم الوجه الكبير للإرهاب. في 11 سبتمبر استهدف الجهاديون إحدى كلا الرأسمالية الأميركية ومقر القيادة المركزية للجيش الأمريكي. في باريس استهدفت الهجمات الجهادية على مجلة فرنسية وسوق يهودي، رموزا لفكرتين فرنسيتين راسختين، وهما الحرية والمساواة. على حد قول رئيس الوزراء الفرنسي، فرنسا الآن في حالة حرب ضد الإسلام المتشدد. هل هذه الحرب استمرار للحرب على الإرهاب التي أعلن عنها الرئيس بوش قبل 13 عاما؟ ما وجه المقارنة بين النهج الفرنسي والنهج الأمريكي؟ كيف ستؤثر الهجمات التي وقعت في باريس على استراتيجية الولايات المتحدة ضد الإرهاب؟ لمناقشة أثر الهجمات التي وقعت في باريس على السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية، يسرني أن أرحب باثنين من كبار الخبراء المؤثرين المعنيين بالإرهاب في واشنطن، نظرة وماثيو ليفيت. Welcome back to Dakhil, Washington. I'm sitting here with my colleagues Nظرة and Matthew Levitt to talk about terrorism, the ideology of terrorism, and what we should be doing about it. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. We in America, we had our 9/11. Paris had its attacks. Can you compare and contrast their week from hell and what happened here in the United States years ago, Juan?
Well, I think Paris is in many ways a wake-up call for Europe, that the concerns about foreign fighters, the ideology and radicalization around terrorism has really come to fruition. You saw last year the canary in the coal mine, the attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels by a Frenchman who had traveled to Syria and Iraq and come back and killed 4 individuals. That really was the first manifestation of what has come out of the heart of the Middle East now, which is this metastasized terrorist movement and the ideology that has really motivated and mobilized individuals now in the heart of the West. And so in some ways, I think, though the degree of impact is different, 9/11 versus the Paris attacks, it does have a galvanizing impact. And you've seen this in the rhetoric of European officials. You've seen it certainly in counterterrorism activities in terms of the disruptions around Europe. And now you're seeing it in the rhetoric, the war on terror, the war on radical Islamism, which is now what's coming out of French authorities. And so this really is a turning point, I think, in terms of how Europe thinks about the threat and thinks about the broader ideological implications of the challenge to Western society from this ideology.
Matt, is this France and Europe's 9/11?
There are two things that are different about this. It's France's 9/11 in the sense that this is the first big attack they're having at home. But as Juan said, something like this has been expected because of the boomerang effect, the blowback from events in Syria and Iraq. But two things are different. The first is the French in particular are very good at tactical counterterrorism. Their security, their police, they're very, very good at dealing with these types of criminal activities. They're not yet good at dealing with the ideological component. Juan and I and some others have written several studies about this, one at the Washington Institute, Fighting the Ideological Battle. Europe is not yet ready. Maybe now after Paris, after Brussels, they'll begin to change, but they have not yet been ready to deal with the counter-narrative, with the ideas. The other way it's different is that until now, what we've seen traditionally worldwide, including in Europe, 7/7 in England, the Madrid bombings were larger bombing attacks. But now we're seeing smaller scale Mumbai, or now you might say Paris style attacks, where people just need to pick up a few weapons. Not a lot of people killed and injured, but very terrifying. Terrorism in the purest sense, hitting softer targets. And terrorists ultimately want to have as many people watching as listening, even more than the number of people dead and wounded. And so this is one thing we're going to be seeing in the context of the battle for the jihadi space between Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Rob, it's very important what Matt just described, because you do have this hybrid form of terrorism. It's not a lone wolf set of actors, and it's not a high-scale attack of the type that we saw in 9/11 or 7/7 in London. But what's also interesting here is that you have individuals who hit what were in essence strategic targets. This wasn't the Eiffel Tower, it wasn't the French security service building, but it was a strategic target ideologically for this movement. And what they've done in the wake of hitting Charlie Hebdo and sparking the debate about the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and what that means vis-a-vis respect for religion, really has sparked a broader debate ideologically. And so what's interesting here to me is not just a different vector of attack and not even just different types of terrorists that may be threatening the West, but it's also the fact that they've picked some strategic targets that matter ideologically and that are now sparking real debates, not just in the West, but also within Muslim communities. That, to me, is a different kind of strategic terrorism that Paris represents.
Well, let's take a look at the several issues that both you gentlemen have just put on the table. Let's start with targets. Matt, targets in Paris, journalists and Jews. How does this resonate in Europe? How does it resonate back in Iraq and Syria and Yemen, where these terrorists received either ideological foundations or perhaps even deeper support than that?
Look, the tension right now in terms of the target choice is that on the one hand, as Juan explained, in Europe, this has really galvanized people to understand that there is a cultural, ideological difference between the ability to disagree with someone and not kill them, as opposed to what we saw at Charlie Hebdo. But in much of the Middle East, they see things very differently. And there isn't this understanding that someone should just be able to make a cartoon of the Prophet and that that should be respected, the right to do that should be respected. And so we're having this debate right now over what should this mean. For some, targeting Jews is less egregious than others. For most people in Europe, this is very egregious. It happens to be that this kosher supermarket, in addition, was in a mixed neighborhood, and one of the heroes of the attack was a French Muslim who happened to save several Jewish shopkeepers. And so I think that what we're going to see moving forward, without question, is very strong counterterrorism measures, but as we've discussed already, how are they going to move forward ideologically? The timing is really interesting, because only a few months earlier, the French, because of events in Syria and Iraq, for the first time put together the first beginnings of a countering violent extremism or a counter-radicalization program. It's only just begun to be put in place. I've argued that it hasn't been focused enough on countering the narrative, but it's just beginning to be there. I imagine that it's going to be toughened up and expanded.
What does this concept mean? I mean, we've talked for years about counter-terrorism. What do you mean by counter-violent extremism? What does that mean more?
Well, that's now become a term of art. It's been part of the lexicon of counterterrorism for some time. President Bush talked about this. He talked about the battle of arms and the battle of ideas. And in the space of battling ideas, it's this notion that you have to, in some ways, find a counter to the narrative, to the allure of the jihadi cause. But more importantly, you have to be able to undermine and counter the ideology and the justification for the violence and the terrorism that these groups are so much a vanguard of. What's interesting to me in terms of what Matt was saying and in terms of countering violent extremism is these groups find very interesting strategic ways in a broader ideological context to feed off of cleavages in societies or in conflicts. And so you look around the world where these groups have manifested and grown in support. In Nigeria, for example, with Boko Haram, they've taken full advantage of the conflict and the socioeconomic problems between North and South, between Muslims and Christians. In Europe now, they've drawn this divide and hit on this cleavage and the problem with targeting of Jewish sites and anti-Semitism. So what's interesting ideologically is these groups not just are finding targets that matter from a tactical perspective that are important, security services and others, but they're now moving toward ideologically important targets and sites.
And you're saying that the French are only just beginning to grapple with the softer side of this, the countering of the ideology and the narrative.
That's right. And even here in the United States, we need to be doing this much, much more robustly. The President has called for a CVE summit on February 18th, long overdue. Look, think of it this way, Rob. It's moving the needle earlier in the process, not just waiting until you have someone who's about to or has carried out an act of violence, who's engaged in a criminal act, but identifying people who are amenable to radical ideas, who are about to go down a radical path, and intervening then before they do something, before they become criminals, and helping them back onto a better path. Think of it as preventing today's events from creating new radicalized people to do tomorrow's events. And a lot of this, if you think of it as strategic counterterrorism, tactical counterterrorism, what phones do we need to be listening on, what doors do we need to be kicking down, arrests in Belgium over the past 24 hours, this is strategic counterterrorism, and it's not very sexy. It's not police, it's not FBI, it's social workers, it's health and human services, but it's critically important.
Just on this theme for a moment, is this something that governments can do, or is this something that local communities, mosques, community centers, schools, and how do you do that in a moment of great urgency when everyone is gripped by the fear that there's another terrorist attack around the corner?
Governments in some ways can't do it alone, and certainly can't be the protagonist in many ways. There's all sorts of reasons why, and why the US, Europe have been challenged in this regard. But Matt is right. Part of this is intervention early on. Part of it is inoculating communities. And in many ways, it's local communities, local credible voices, local networks that are going to have to counter this. The US government has talked about this as creating a grassroots counter movement to the ideology, of building a network of networks to counter the network of radical ideologues and terrorists. And that means that voices within Muslim communities have to speak out and have to counter the ideology. There has to be alternatives to the vision of heroism that these jihadi causes give to Muslim youth, for example. And so you've seen ex-jihadis sort of organize and try to counter the ideology. You've got groups like Sisters Against Violent Extremism that have formed chapters around the world to bring mothers and women to the fight. You have groups like the movements.org, which are a group of anti-violent movements around the world that are trying to coordinate to counter violent extremism in a variety of forms. And so the idea is you have to have community-based efforts to inoculate those who are susceptible to this radical cause. And in many ways, governments aren't the credible voice. And certainly in the US context, the US government is not going to be determining the correct interpretations of the Hadith or the Quran, and which voices within Islam are the right ones to counter this movement.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to discuss how the events in Paris will affect American counterterrorism strategy in just a moment. We have quite a lot of counterterrorism brain power on our show today. My guests are Juan Zarate, who you know is a regular panelist on Dakhil, Washington. Juan is a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the senior national security consultant and analyst for CBS News. One of our nation's leading counterterrorism and national security experts, he served in the administration of President George W. Bush as Assistant Secretary to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor. Sitting to his right is my colleague Matthew Levitt, the director of the Stein Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence at the Washington Institute. Matt served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. In that capacity, he played a central role in efforts to protect the American financial system from abuse and to deny terrorists, weapons proliferators, and other rogue actors the ability to finance threats to American national security. Previously, Matt served as a counterterrorism intelligence analyst at the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where he provided analytical support for counterterrorism operations, including after the 9/11 attacks. Matt is the author of several fine books on Hamas, Hezbollah, and how to negotiate in the face of terrorism. Gentlemen, the French Prime Minister famously said that his country is at war with radical Islamism. These are terms that American politicians don't often use. Why? And should they? Matt?
Officials are concerned about displaying this as a war against Islam, when what we're dealing with is a very small minority of radical individuals who claim to be doing things in the name of this religion, but don't represent the vast majority of Muslims, of course. The problem is we have to be able to call a spade, and in order to put together a counter narrative, you have to be able to talk about the issues that are driving the people to carry out these acts of violence. As Juan said, it's important, therefore, to have Muslim communities come up and get involved in this, because this is not something that U.S. government can do. But it has tremendous effects not only in Europe but in the United States, and we saw it just this week as an individual who, acting on his own, decided to, in support of ISIS, buy some bullets, buy some guns, with the intention apparently of going to Capitol Hill and carrying out an attack here not far from where we're sitting. FBI found out about it and arrested him. He has his first hearing today. But these are issues that are going on right now today, not only in Belgium and France, but here in the United States.
So you would appreciate if American leaders were more upfront about the nature of the threat?
On the one hand, not saying that this is about Islam or about Muslims, but I do think we need to explain to the public and be clear about what radical Islamism means, how that is different from the religion, but how this is part of the ideological driver that we are dealing with. We're not dealing with a global onslaught of Irish Republican terrorism. The fact that the vast majority of terrorists today are doing this in the name of a particular ideology means we have to contend with that ideology.
And Juan, how will Paris more broadly affect American counterterrorism strategy?
Well, it's already affecting the political debate around our counterterrorism strategy. And so this question about the lexicon, what language do we use to talk about this ideological problem, whether or not you call it a war, that links Boston and Benghazi and Paris and the attacks around the world. That is now part of the American debate yet again, when the administration, the Obama administration, came into power really not wanting to talk in those terms, not wanting to deal with the ideological dimensions. In addition, you've had the Obama administration very much wanting to constrain how it has talked about the war on terror. And so it came in saying our war is just against the Al-Qaeda core that attacked us on 9/11. And in fact, we don't want to be perpetually at war. And so we're going to begin to draw back in terms of both that lexicon as well as our posture. But Paris in some ways is changing that. A bit like the beheading videos changed our posture toward the Islamic State and forced the United States to create a coalition to get engaged with air power.
How serious is the threat of sort of this middle type of terrorism, not lone wolf, not grand conspiracies? How serious is that in the United States?
Look, we have multiple sets of threats that are going on at the same time. U.S. counterterrorism officials describe this Khorasan group, an Al-Qaeda element resident in Syria, where they have basically safe haven, combining core Al-Qaeda, skilled people, bomb makers, and many of these Western foreign fighters. We have these foreign directed attacks of the type that we've seen over the past week, and we have homegrown violent extremists like we've seen just this week in Ohio, and then some that don't fall pretty into any one of these particular boxes. All of these are possible, but the one that keeps me up at night more than anything else is the homegrown violent extremist, because that person may not come across the radar of law enforcement, may not trip any of our wires, sending or receiving money, being in communication with someone, traveling somewhere, and is therefore very difficult to identify.
So
the good news,
not somebody who's been to Iraq and Syria.
Correct. U.S. counterterrorism officials are putting together a massive database in cooperation with our foreign allies of everybody who's gone or tried to go to Syria and Iraq. We're getting our hands around that. The people that we've seen in Paris were people that the French knew about. The people that were just raided in Belgium were people that were being under surveillance for several weeks. But it's the guy that we don't know about that I'm concerned about. And it's this ideology, again, that comes down to it, because it's out there on the social media. It's not like 9/11 where Al-Qaeda would put something out there in a one-directional communication and hope someone went online and found it. Now there's communication back and forth on Ask FM, on Twitter, on Facebook, and it's a much more immediate to people. It's not some far-off thing in Afghanistan. It's not even that Syria is geographically closer. Virtual world, it's right there in your mama's basement.
Okay, we only have a minute left. Let me ask you one. If you had a marginal dollar and you wanted to spend it, or a marginal $100 million to be American, to help address this threat? Would it be fighting in Iraq and Syria? Would it be reform in American prisons? Would it be policing in Minneapolis? Where would you put your money?
Yeah, I think you would have to divide it. How neatly we would divide it, we'd have to talk about in more detail. But I think part of it would have to go to some kinetic activity abroad, supporting partners in places like Nigeria, supporting the French in Mali, supporting any activity in Europe. And so ensuring that we have the capabilities to support suppression of these groups and dealing with the safe haven abroad. And so that has to be a key component of what we do to include the Islamic State's holdings. But also figuring out how to seed capital, provide funding for these networks and these activities in the homeland that would allow U.S. populations to be inoculated from this ideology. That doesn't take a lot of money, actually, and in comparison to paying for military power abroad is a marginal cost. We just have to invest in that.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm sorry that we run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us here on Dakhil, Washington.
Thanks,
Matt Levitt, Juan Zarate.
Thank you, Rob.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول استراتيجية الأميركية ضد الإرهاب الجهادي، أرجو أن تتصلوا بي مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.